Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Greenbook Podcast. It's Karen Lynch. I'm happy to be hosting today and so glad to be here with you and with our guest today. I am speaking with Kira Greenberg, who I've known for a few years now. She's currently with Pernod Ricard as the senior manager brand insights on the Jameson brand, which I will talk a little bit about my personal connection to that brand and the affinity I have for Ireland, but that's a separate story. So before I even talk too much about that and we can enjoy the category, Kira, welcome to the Greenbook Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
And I'm so happy you are here. And, shout out for Kira, who is taking this call from a beach house on the Jersey Shore, which has me, if you've been listening long enough, you know how I am, people. And you know that I'm on my way down. So I hope it's a sunnier weekend than I think it might prove to be for you. But
I hope so too.
So glad you're here. Why don't you, Kira, take a minute and just tell everybody a little bit about your role, kind of just by way of background. Tell them, yourself, your current role, and then we'll move into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Karen said, I am the brand insights lead for the Jameson team at Pernod Ricard USA. And I've been here about a year and a half. So I've sort of, settled into the role and have carved out a space very much as what I would call like a thought partner to the brand team. So doing a lot of work to help them, creatively, to help them strategically, and sort of just, be there as almost an internal strategist.
I love the phrase thought partner. I don't know that I've heard that before, but that's what a strategist does, right? It helps people do their best critical thinking. So I
Yeah.
like that.
Thank
Very
you.
cool. Yeah, very
Yeah.
cool. Very cool. So, in kind of pulling up some research for this episode, I'm like, yes, the company is headquartered in Paris. So it's really interesting to me. Headquartered in Paris, you're working here in the New York area, and this is like a traditional Irish brand. Talk to me about that multinational dynamic. Does that come into play in your work? Is there kind of something that's formative in what you do that has to do with the global nature of all of it?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're actually like a pretty matrixed organization, right? We do have headquarters in Paris, and then, I work on Jameson, but the whole company, we have so many different brands, right? We have scotches, we have tequilas, we have brands where their brand teams are sort of sitting in other markets as well. And so honestly, my background is in anthropology and in like deep qualitative research. And so a lot of what I think I do also is just really like paying attention to, cultural difference and cultural nuance and making sure that sort of thinking is, present in the things that I do. But honestly, like it's just great to be able to have so many different perspectives in the room. And, oftentimes it's also about, I think specifically for Jameson, understanding the differences between a global market versus a US market. The work that I do is specifically just for the US. And so it's, working with those global teams to figure out, okay, what are those cultural nuances? How is the US different? What are the ways that we want to maybe approach this differently? And then how do we work with the global teams to, really like get alignment on that?
Yeah, many years ago when I was an independent qualitative researcher, I was working very closely with a personal care brand that had headquarters overseas. And we had to understand, we often went out and we went in homes and we did kind of shop alongs largely to kind of point out the differences to corporate, right? It was like, this is what this market feels or thinks or how they behave around a certain topic of personal care compared to overseas. So there was a
Mhm.
lot of that kind of explaining the differences in some of the work that the team that I worked with did. So I totally get that. It resonates completely.
Yeah.
Kira, let's talk a little bit about then your journey to this position, right? Because just a few years ago you were at Warner Brothers Discovery, which is what had brought you onto the stage at IAX North America. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about some of the milestones in your career and how you got to this current position.
Yeah, it's been a journey for sure. That is the word I would use as well. But like I alluded to, my background is in anthropology, specifically cultural and linguistic anthropology. So have done a lot of work historically on really wanting to understand culture, wanting to understand, shared culture, things like media, things like advertising, and the ways that brands are really like communicating and showing up in the world. Because those are the things that I think shape culture, and people engage with them and they talk about it, and I find it to be really fascinating. So I also was at a very tiny qualitative research agency for a little while, and learned that this was a career that I felt really passionate about. And it feels, really awesome to be able to just ask questions and like think creatively for a living. So that's cool. Um, and I wound up after that, yes, at Warner Brothers Discovery, although it was Turner, and then it was Warner Media, and then it was, Warner, whatever, went through like 17 mergers. Um, and I think there I learned a lot about being on the brand side of things, and how that's really different from being agency side, obviously. But um, the work becomes more of that thought partnership, strategic type of work, while also needing to, sort of anticipate business needs, anticipate research questions, and really being able to like help bring insights to life for teams that may not necessarily be so research savvy. Some of them are, but right, like wanting to make sure stories are simple and easily digestible and actionable. So I learned a lot there, working sort of across the business, sometimes on product questions, around Max or HBO Max, and sometimes on like more marketing and multicultural marketing. Um, so did honestly played many different roles at that company. And I unfortunately was caught up in a round of layoffs a couple of years ago, which I think is, standard for the industry, and it happens to
Happens.
the
Yeah.
best of us.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky and grateful that I fairly quickly landed myself at Pernod, which I have, it's been a really, really interesting shift. Obviously, it is an entirely different industry, with so many things that I have had to learn really, really quickly. And now I feel quite settled in it, and I'm still getting to, do a lot of the same work that I was, and like bringing some of those skills that I learned both at my qual agency and also at Warner. Um, but I've also learned a lot of new things, and I'm getting to do some new things too, like, work with like tangible products and understand how people shop, and, things like that, which I just like never really thought about before. So that's been really cool.
I think I have so many follow-up questions now, which this is what I told you. I said I'm going to have a lot of follow-ups. Forget the brief. I'm going to have questions. So, we were just at our IX North America event, and I had a fireside chat with a woman who, she actually kind of switched categories as well, and now she's kind of in the medical space, and still doing insights work, obviously, but it's just in more of like the medical healthcare space, and she had been in like financial services. So the idea of like switching categories, I think for a lot of people, they might have the mindset of, I'm in CPG, I'm going to stay in CPG, or I'm in entertainment, I'm going to stay in entertainment. But I think now I'm hearing kind of two people say the change of categories is actually kind of disrupting your brain perhaps and bringing new thinking. Is that accurate? How would you describe that categorical switch?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Love to have my brain disrupted, I guess. But and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about, sort of creativity and storytelling in a little bit, but something I've been thinking about is how important those soft skills are to switching categories, because those are the things that are, resonant and relevant no matter what. Things can be learned, right? Like categories can be learned. It might not be easy, but it is learnable. Nuances and, et cetera. But I think the thing that is really wonderful about insights is that like those sorts of soft creative skills, storytelling, framework building, strategy, those sorts of things are so crucial across categories. And I think like for me anyway, I can't speak to everybody's experience, but for me, like a lot of the work that I was doing at Warner was also sort of like broad, not like sort of, future oriented. So some like future trend work, some just like general, how are people's values shifting? How like just sort of paying attention to culture and things around me. Um and really honing those skills has been a huge, huge thing for my role now, right? Because as I was doing sort of like broader consumer insights, and now as a more sort of specific brand insights person, I'm getting to use those consumer insights sorts of skills, like paying attention to the world around me and feel sensing shifts in the wind and all of those sorts of things to help anticipate where consumers and culture are heading.
Yeah, really, really cool. And again, like I keep I keep going back in my head sort of romantically towards the brand itself and our family's trip to Ireland and kind of the Jameson experience, which was built into, that between that and Guinness, it's like we're like
Did
check
you
the
go
box.
down to Cork or were
Yeah.
you in Dublin?
Yes,
Yeah.
we were in Cork.
Okay.
And anyway, and so I keep smiling because I keep thinking about this, like how this was a part of my family's itinerary. So talk about like brand affinity. We built it into our family's trip to Ireland. My children were all kind of young adults at that time, and like what's that about, like just how important it is as a brand that's like, oh, we're going to make that stop. We were on our way up, we did the whole drive around and then up to Dublin, but that was one stop on our way. Is like, yeah, we're doing this. So anyway, what a cool brand that you're working on. And you just must have, before we get into the storytelling, you must just have frequent encounters with brand affinity, is what I would imagine.
Totally. Yeah. It's such an iconic brand. And before I joined this company, like I was not entrenched in this world at all. Like I, was not really thinking deeply about spirits or Bev Alc at all. And I must admit, like I was a little bit surprised at how much affinity people have for spirits brands and, Jameson included. And it's really awesome. Like everybody has, of course, they have stories about Jameson, right? And they have, oh, Jameson is blank, right? They have like their own sort of real like thinking and feelings around what it stands for as a brand, often rooted in experience, but also just like, as a brand, it was born in like the Brooklyn bar scene in the US anyway. Obviously, abroad it has a different sort of story, but in the US, it was so cool and it is so cool. And I think that's how a lot of people think about it.
Yeah.
Um, and yes, there is a lot of affinity for it whenever I tell people where I work, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure, especially like again, my kids are young adult kids, so then like after that trip, it was like sealed that the brand loyalty started with the parents. Anyway, it kind of cracks me up.
Excellent. And we thank
Yeah.
you for that.
Yes, no problem.
Yeah.
I aim to please.
Yeah.
So funny. But let's talk about that storytelling, because again, I'm sure you have a million, and I imagine they'd be a lot of fun, right? Just some of the work that you must do, especially like kind of as somebody who has an ethnography and anthropology at your roots. Like I can only imagine how fun the work is. But let's take a step back, get into the concept of storytelling, because that's something that you're passionate about. um, and I think that it goes beyond just you know your take on storytelling, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'd like you to explain it, but it's more than just using storytelling to communicate the insights. It's more about using stories to kind of inform that brand strategic decision making. Like the stories serve a purpose. So let's just talk about that. What's your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think especially because my stakeholders are primarily marketers. Marketers are creatives, right? They're at their core, I think, not all of them, but a lot of the ones that I work with specifically are, they go with their gut and they feel things and they know what's right and they know what isn't right. And so the way to really, I think, get through to and help marketers understand consumers and culture and whatever is emotionally, and is, making sure that they feel what it is that you are trying to tell them. And so I think, interestingly, a colleague at Pernod recently said, I'm going to steal his line just because it really resonated with me and I thought it was awesome. And he was talking to the marketers in the room. Shout out to Johan if he hears this, but he was talking to the marketers in the room, but he said that their job as marketers is to make the complex simple, which I think we've all heard before. But then his add to it was, and make the simple interesting. And
Mm,
that was a piece that I had never heard before. And I think that is our job as well. Um, for the consumer, they need simplicity, of course, and they want to be interested. And I do think that like that is our job to the marketers as well. And so for me, that is what storytelling is all about, is finding, it's not about like flattening nuance, and it's not about you know, like taking away contradictions or tensions or anything like that, but leaning into them to explore, like, okay, what is the tension here? What is the complexity? And simplifying that into a really clear um, narrative, and then finding a way to make that feel interesting. Because like flat and simple isn't interesting, but
yeah.
it's only, in points of tension and points of like it's only in points of tension, I think, where the story really lies. So yeah.
There's so much to what you just said that I'm like, okay, that is probably one of the most critical conversations I've ever had around how complex and challenging the work really is. And I think a lot of times with marketing, having a marketing background, right, which is what brought me into insights in the first place, there was this feeling out in the world I sensed of people thinking marketing is easy. And the
Mm,
way you just said it, it shows the complexity that actually really good marketing is super complex because you have so much work to do. So, anyway, so shout out to you for kind of explaining it in such a way that makes sense and showcases how really complex it is to do good marketing. So let's kind of break that down a little bit. I don't know if you have an example. I didn't give you a whole lot of time to like think through examples, but do you have kind of an example of that very concept about, where kind of insights helps you tell a story that really resonates with people?
the first one that really comes to mind is, obviously we have a lot of sort of foundational work for the brand and for all of our brands, including, like segmentations and demand maps and that kind of stuff. And um, as part of our needs model, obviously we know kind of Jameson, what are the needs that are like most important to the brand and what are the things that we are trying to really address. In the last couple of years, it became really clear that, the brand would like to and needs to grow with additional audiences, right? And with specifically multicultural and sort of like other audiences that aren't so ingrained in, Jameson. And it became really clear to us that we were like, right. So in needing to grow with these new audiences, we understand what these needs look like for our current audiences. We understand how those manifest, what that feels like. They had done qual around it. But we don't actually know whether these feel the same for these new audiences, right? We don't actually know whether these needs are, whether they manifest in the same way or like how they manifest and, whatnot. And so did some very deep qual with these groups, which is always going to be my favorite. And it turns out like these actually do manifest in quite a different way, and they need to be shown differently to really, address these audiences and resonate with these audiences. And I think that ultimately that is quite an obvious, like, right, of course these needs look different and feel different, and everybody knew that. But the point was, okay, but what is it? Like, how do we need to be showing that, we are addressing these needs? How do we need to be speaking to these consumers in order to resonate with them more deeply? And then also like pulling apart the nuances and points of connection, right? Because at the end of the day, we can only do so much. We can only make so many pieces of content, so many pieces of, whatever. And so trying to make, like, distill very, very clearly where things could potentially overlap and where there need to be really clear sort of like moments of pulling them apart.
Another stellar concept to tease out that you just shared is we people who have ever done qualitative research in particular and listening to people speak, and a lot of it is like, yes, common sense, yes, I knew that has happened throughout the entirety of my career, where it's like, yes, that's all logical. You hear people say it and it kind of validates things that you might have thought, or it makes tangible interconnected thoughts. So there's something about that process. But the key is not then dismissing what you've
Mm-hmm.
heard as, yeah, that's common sense, it's not new, but then making the next connection, like, okay, so we've heard this, it makes sense to us. That's actually solid research there because it makes sense to us. Therefore, we know we can act on it, right? It resonates somehow, and we can do more with it now that we kind of have this kind of foundational validation almost of random thoughts. So,
Love validation of random thoughts.
yeah.
Yes.
Yes, love validation. I do too, across the world, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this kind of, one of the things that we talked about earlier, even earlier in this conversation, is the idea of being kind of like culturally relevant to different audiences. And here you are, like, multinational, and yes, you have finite numbers of stories you can tell. How do you do that? Like, how do you dissect something that might be universal or culturally relevant in one area? I know you're focused kind of on the US. So what does that look like, from almost like a thought journey, right? From when you're actually informing thoughts, but you're, is it methodologically different? Is it debriefing different? How do you get to cultural relevance with what you're hearing? Or did it start at project inception?
That's such a good question. I think there's a few things to that. I think the first is like, I mean, first of all, I think this piece of it is very much an art, more than a science, which is there are manifestations of things that are, different. And, this cultural group does or says or thinks things differently than this cultural group or whatever. But then I think the art of that is, okay, but what is the overarching, human need that sits across that? And or, um what is the like cultural tension that they're responding to, right? Because the world is happening all around us, and people are constantly responding to things that are happening in the world. And I think like nothing happens in a vacuum, right? So everything is responding to something. And so I think it is honestly the most important piece is not taking anything in a vacuum and understanding like what are the things that is connected to help to try to find the unifying story. But that said, there are times and moments where cultural specificity is unbelievably important. And so I think that's the piece where, partnership and like thought partnership and strategic partnership comes into play, where you're having these conversations around what are we actually trying to do here, right? Are we trying to be sort of capital C culturally relevant, right? Or are we trying to be culturally relevant to a specific group? And are we trying to, drive consideration or brand affinity or whatever with X consumer group? Or are we trying to, make a massive impact across the board?
So tell me now, building on that, how does trend work? So we've talked about kind of going out and doing research, but how does trend work? Global trends, for example, or local trends, or U.S. trends. How does that factor in? How do you kind of pull in these trends to the work that you're doing to kind of shape the direction you're giving or the conversations you're having with your stakeholders?
Honestly, I think it's similar. It is sort of feeling the macro trends and being really just like in the gut, like aware of what the macro is, while also paying attention to the micro and knowing sort of when to balance like, agility and response to the micro versus uh, playing the long game, for lack of a better term, right? And I think when it comes to pulling those things together for marketers and for brand teams, it is not telling them what they don't need to know, right? It is like they don't need to be as entrenched in the sort of like trends and shift as an insights person is. I think they need to be, I mean, they're smart, they're also aware of the things that are going on and they're aware of how that's impacting their business, but they, I think, need to sometimes have the connections drawn and need to have the dots sort of like connected to help plan for the future and also to help stay agile in this current moment.
There's something about just being tapped in
Yeah.
to not just doing trend work. Like, so I've talked to a lot of people who are like, we do specific trend work, and they're all about kind of, predictive thinking and future thinking, and kind of looking out there and how do the trends inform our work, blah, blah, blah. But there's something also very interesting about just being tapped into pop culture or current culture, that, you know, I have this example, of, without being like too, giving away too much, but like somebody made a comparison to Jennifer Coolidge, for example, and somebody heard that interpretation and was like, oh God, that's such a negative. She's so dated. She's so old, going back to like, the beginning of her career. And I'm like, oh no, you're not in touch anymore. Like,
Right.
she's super, like,
Peppa
no,
Pig, come on.
look her up right now. She's
Yeah.
she's an icon. So like
Yeah.
she had this like career renaissance that if you weren't paying attention, you missed.
Yeah.
And I think that on some level, the job of an insights professional will always be to connect those dots too. So, pressure to stay in touch. Like, no, like we're not talking about so and so anymore, but we are back to her or back to him or whatever. Like, you have to pay attention to pop culture and to societal trends. Like, you have no choice, because you might hear something in a group that, or in a conversation or in an interview, that only makes sense if you understand the context that's around it.
I
Anyway, that
totally
might be my
agree.
bandwagon.
And no. I completely agree. And it makes the insights so much richer and so much better when they're connected to, a broader thing. That just interestingly, that just reminded me, like in anthropology, um, they always talk about the importance of like the insider outsider dynamic. Like you are sort of trying to maintain this ideal of simultaneously being an observer and also a participant at the same time, and that is what makes for like good ethnography or like good anthropology. And I think that that remains true. Like that is a concept from academia, as stale as it can be, that I try to bring with me, which is maintaining a sense of neutrality and sort of like observation, while at the same time you need to experience it to get it. You do.
Yeah. There was a ethnographic project from years ago, early in my career. I'll tell you a quick story and hope it helps bring that concept to life. I was with people who were kind of below the poverty level. We were talking about life insurance policies, and this was all about getting people to kind of pay their premiums. And so I'm in this woman's home, like an older woman. We're in the deep South, and we're just having the same conversation that I have with everybody. But when I gave her at the time, oh God, I'm so dating myself, but we handed out incentive checks to people. So when I handed her incentive check, she started to weep. She started to call me an angel. She asked if somebody could come in and take my photo. Um, and suddenly I had a different experience with this interview because I was in it then.
Yeah.
I became like a player in the moment. And so when you're talking about that inside outside thing, I went from outside to inside in the gesture that then
Yeah.
became a part of how I embodied the research. It was
Exactly.
it was life-changing for me. And I'm like, oh, I don't, and I'm getting goosebumps now just thinking about it. It was a formative moment that I will never forget, is that moment when everything changed in the entirety of the project.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for indulging me and listening.
Yeah, no, of course. And look, I mean, not to get on my bandwagon now, but those are the kinds of things that like just can't be replaced. Those real human moments. And I know everyone is talking about how research is shifting and how insights are shifting and et cetera. Um, and there's, I have many complex thoughts on that, but that is the thing that can't be replaced.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about some of those complex thoughts, shall we? Because because you opened up that door for me. Again, not a part of the brief, but one of the things I did want to talk to you about is, as a creative thinker and as kind of somebody who is kind of working in service to marketing, and so you're tapped into a lot of different tools and techniques and methodologies and I'm sure platforms and ways of going about your work. And I'm sure you've done a combination of like, ad hoc research where you're paying other people and DIY research where you're doing it yourself. Like, I just know that about you. What are some of the kind of tools that are critical to your trade currently that you could share? Nothing that's proprietary, of course, but
Yeah,
are there things that you're relying on that help you do the work today in May of 2025?
I definitely will say I have not entirely, but I have joined the bandwagon on, utilizing AI in um really in like front end of research, right? So in, helping with questionnaires or brief writing or like that sort of thing. Um Not for everything, but in moments of like, oh, I actually just don't have time to do this. Like let me get a little help. But I still I mean, I enjoy the writing process. It helps me sort of formulate my thoughts when I am actively writing them. So I don't do a ton of that, but I think you know, as like an insights function, we have started to lean into a little bit more AI research and like not us specifically, but with vendors who have elements of AI like ingrained into their functions. And it's definitely allowed for, of course, faster turnaround of things, uh, less expensive, like all of those sorts of benefits are so real and make a lot of sense and are super valuable. And they have definitely, I think, for things that you don't need a ton of depth for, been awesome, right? Things where you're not missing anything from the human, I think fantastic. Like I love a quick turnaround and I love, a more affordable study. Um I like humans. And I think, where I have found the best work that incorporates different kinds of AI is where it actually is like a true partnership between human and AI. And
Mm.
it doesn't feel like, you know, the research just kind of like was written by AI, but it feels like it was maybe an initial, like, here's where the themes lie. Now let me like go in and do my own storytelling. That is where I much prefer for AI
Yeah.
to live. Um, Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this is maybe going to sound crazy, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the next, I don't know, 7 years, something like that, who knows, 5 to 10 years, let's say, there was a shift back to the depth and the human and the like, you know, researchers and insights folks wanting to lean away from the AI.
Yeah. I do hope that's the case. I think right now my take is that if you're a I've said this before on the exchange that I do, the weekly live stream that I do, like if you're a research provider, you need to have AI tools for the efficiencies, for the economies of scale, for the speed to turnaround, kind of speed of turnaround thing. So like if you're on that side of the ecosystem, like of course you have to be leaning into all of this to stay relevant and to be a stronger tool or service provider. And on the brand side, I think you and others like you are charged with having the ability to think through, when do we need to go deeper? When
Yeah.
is this okay?
Hmm.
And that thought process, that critical thinking about this one I can do with a quick turnaround and get an AI support. This one, nope, we just need to go depth and we need to really just talk to human beings. I think that there will always be that need for that level decision making
Yeah.
before you go in. Just like we used to have to decide, is this a focus group or an IDI? Or
Right.
is this a quant study or a qual study? Like there's always been these moments in time where you have to make an executive decision about the type of work you do. I see that as the future. I see that becoming more and more important, that you become acutely aware of where is it an assist? Where do we need to get that depth?
Yeah,
My
I
my
really like that. Like, it is a tool that can be added to our toolbox and, sets of methodologies, but it's not the be all and end all.
yeah.
Um, Honestly, and maybe this is just showing my like slight Luddite nature or whatever, but it's the synthetic data that freaks me out a little bit. I'm not quite there yet. I'm working on learning more about it to get over it, but it freaks me out.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. I know later today I'm doing, which by the time this airs, this will have been past tense, but we're talking a bit more about synthetic data week after week. Like we're digging into, both the promises and the pitfalls. It's just that is anyway, I think we always say like the garbage in, garbage out concept, and
Yeah.
garbage might be too harsh of a word because
Hmm.
talking about cultural relevance, like there's just a lot of bias in there, and we have to work on the right sampling and make sure that what's being inputted is actually reflective, or at least properly labeled as dissected. There's just so many nuances with synthetic data. That's an
Yeah.
entirely different podcast
Oh,
episode, Kira, really.
totally. Well, I'll be back. So,
Excellent, excellent.
um, no, I mean, I guess my only other thought on this that I just want to share is like, to bring it back to what we were talking about. I think as a creative person and as a storyteller and as someone who I feel it is so important to feel a connection to the data and to feel a connection to um that source of truth in order for me to be able to tell good stories. Like, if I don't feel it, I can't tell a good story.
Yeah.
And so we're leaning so heavily on AI, especially for qual. Where that leads me is I'm less ingrained in the story, and it makes for what I feel is sometimes an overly simplistic, like, I haven't wrestled with the tensions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And let's go full circle to what you said earlier. Shout out to Johan. It doesn't make the simple interesting, right? We need
Yes.
to, we need to keep, we need to, even if it's simple, we need to keep making it interesting. That's the job. So,
Yeah.
especially when you're informing the stakeholders you're informing. So, I love this conversation so much, Kira. What did we not get to that you really wish I had asked you about? Any questions that you're like, God, I wish Karen had asked me this?
Oh, that is a great question. I mean, you ask great questions. I don't know.
The answer can always be, we're good. You covered it. That's fine. Sometimes people come into this with the wish that we covered something. And if I don't do it, then I feel bad because they're like, oh, I wish we had talked about this. So I never want people to leave, a guest spot wanting to have had something that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So thus the
No,
need for the
I
question.
feel great about this. Thank you.
Cool. Very cool. You're welcome. So then I will charge you with, the future of insights. So our tagline at Greenbook is the future of insights. And we're always kind of asking people that. We talked a little bit about it with kind of AI, but outside of that, and thinking about the work you do and thinking about the conversation we had, whether it's storytelling or cultural relevance or any of those other buckets that we've covered, multinational companies and brands, what do you think the future of insights entails?
I think that it is much closer, like, strategic partnership with stakeholders. I've been on a lot of insights teams where even internally, you're delivering the story, interesting as it might be, and then you say, "Okay, bye," like, enjoy. And I think something that I have found to be really important is really, really continuing to work those insights into everything, and ensuring that, like, ensuring not only alignment, but, like, making sure that you are helping them to embed that in, the work moving forward. And so, like, for me, what that has meant is, like, a lot of workshops, a lot of, collaboration. And I think that as teams sort of, obviously budgets are tight everywhere. Obviously timelines are tighter everywhere, right? And so
Yeah,
as
yeah,
there's more pressure on stakeholder groups and marketing teams and whoever else you might be delivering insights to, I think being able to play that strategic partnership role as an
yeah,
insights person is going to become even more and more important.
yeah, yeah. I love that. Always the thought partner. You are always the thought partner. I love it so much. Kira, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
It was great on my part too. Yes, such a pleasure. So, thank you to our audience for tuning in. Everybody listening, we are so grateful for you, and we appreciate you showing up, time after time to tune in. And thank you to Big Bad Audio, who is our audio and now video editor. Thank you for what you do, and the entire Green Book team that gets this out to you, from Bridget to our marketing team. I appreciate all of you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.